Hey guys, Jarretman here, back with some more 500 zoom, usual stuff. Gonna be two-tabling. It's a Monday afternoon right now, so the pool is not the biggest, and it is not the best pool that I've played in, but it's a good time to make a video. Tens, we would normally 3-bet a decent amount, but I think versus this player, he opens relatively tighter. So I'm gonna just make the call with tens. And we get an interesting turn spot with tens here again because we kind of crush his range. So I kind of don't want to bet too big on table 2. And a large portion of our range does want to bet for the small size on the turn. We can include some big bets, and obviously that hand can do both. Table 1, a very good board for the big blind. We can even bet this hand for 1/3 some of the time, and we get our high number, so we will bet it. I think we prefer to bet when we have a club blocker, and I don't think we ever want to bet for the large size with Queen Jack here. And the river is a little bit interesting. Interesting in the sense that we now have Jack 9, but so does he. We get our low number. We could go for a check raise here, actually, on table 1. Some of the time. I'm not a huge fan. I'm not a huge fan of our blockers. But the Jack of Diamonds is nice, I guess, and the Queen's kind of neutral, so maybe this hand is a better bluff. I think I want to block his 10x and 8x on the river. And I guess this hand does that, so yeah, maybe I should have considered bluffing that one more often on the river. Maybe even pure bluff it. I know I got my very low number, but maybe this one is a pure bluff. I was just thinking, my logic in this hand on the river is considering how often we bet 1/3 on the turn and considering how much air we have on the river. If I just follow through with every air hand that I have, we're going to be way over bluffing. And it's a spot that I think people will call you down appropriately, or maybe even call you down too much, because again, it's a spot it's very easy to over bluff in my opinion. But like I've said 100 times on this channel or these videos, I tend to attempt to not worry about that. I attempt to bluff the right frequencies. Keyword attempt. So table 1, these boards are always difficult to play small blind versus big blind when they're monotone. I think we start with a lot of checks on this board. I think if you wanted to simplify on this board to checking your range, that would be very reasonable. King 6 off is going to be a defend versus the min raise. I think this player opens a little bit tighter, so maybe we could fold the King 6 off, but it will be a defend versus a min raise. Okay, we roll a check on table 1. I think this is a bad card for us. Okay, and we get a bet on table 2. This hand I prefer to bet for small if we're going to bet it. I don't think we should bet it all the time, but if we are going to bet, I like betting it for the 1/3 because our equity when called versus when we bet large is really terrible. We can check raise, we can check call on table 1. I get a low number, we'll go for the check call. And I'm going to value check our king high. He can have low pairs. We obviously lose to a lot of ace highs and a lot of other hands. I don't think on table 1 we have enough 2x to justify ever donking this river. But I think we can check raise versus this line. Versus the non-overbet river, I think we can check raise. He's supposed to be betting very thin. Like maybe even, like for example, King 5 would still have to bet here. in his shoes. And in reality, the solver will check back the flop with a lot of flushes, but in reality, maybe you can make the argument that people do not check it back. We roll, this is a low frequency 4-bet on table 2, but being 160 big blinds deep, I think 10 starts to shift more into the calling range than it does into the 4-bet range. But mixing in some 4-bets is pretty reasonable. And I think on this texture, we just don't do any raising. Any raising with our hand, and I don't think we really want to do any raising with our range either. If we were, oh, woohoo, unlock the chest, 20 cents. I think if we were much deeper, like 300 big blinds deep, then you're going to start seeing us mix in some raises because we just have some hands that really want to put the raise in. So this is a very bad turn card for him, and he should be checking, if not range, almost his entire range. So betting 10s for protection here, it's a thing, but it's less good when he still has all of the strong hands in his range. We could mix in some raises with the ace-2 versus small size. And I don't think we need to bluff 10s. I think 10s has enough showdown value. We'll have enough floats like king-jack of clubs that can't bet the turn that can now bluff on the river, hands like that. Okay, good thing we didn't bluff at any point or bet. I'm just considering donking on table 1. I don't like it, to be honest. It is a spot where we could have some donks, but if people are playing this board as a bet 1/3 with their range, then donking on the 7 is not as much of a thing. It could still be a thing though. And now on the river, we have a choice between checking to call or betting small ourselves, as we usually do in these weak aces spots. Usually an ace that doesn't play, an ace where our kicker doesn't play, like we chop with all worse aces. Usually it doesn't ever bet big. It doesn't bet larger than, 1/3 or a very small bet, because the hands that have to call us down versus the large bet, just we're not going to get called by a 10 as much, or ever potentially. But when we bet small, we can get called by a 10, or we can get called by a pocket pair, a king high, hands like that. And it's not like we don't have a lot of bluff candidates here. We have tons of straight draws that didn't raise the flop. We have tons of floats, like even king jack with 1 heart or king jack with 1 club on the flop, hands like that, that will definitely want to bluff the river. And I think 2 sizes is necessary here on this river. I think we're giving up too much EV if we just do 1 size, because we have a lot of hands still. Specifically, well, not a lot of hands, but specifically a 7 doesn't really want to bet for the small size all the time. It's nice to include potentially some hands like 10-7 or an ace-7 trap into our small betting range some low percentage of the time, because then it protects our small betting range, so your opponent can't just raise you with, first of all, they can't just raise you with any ace, or they can't just raise you, like if the best hand you ever bet on the river for the small size is a weak ace that chops, then he can raise you with any ace to a large size because he ties with your best hand, and then he can raise tons of bluffs, and he can raise tons of all the hands that beat you. So it's nice to include some traps in your small betting range there. But overall, I think a 7's preferred size is an overbet on this river. This board's very good for the button. You can do a lot of things on this board. You can have the overall quote-unquote best strategy, as it, well, obviously as it always is to have multiple sizings on the flop. But there's a lot of boards where multiple sizings doesn't really gain you any EV. On this board, I think it would gain you some EV. Is it worth having multiple sizes for that EV gain? I don't know. But yeah, we could even have an overbet on this board if we wanted to. He doesn't have jacks and tens. Like, he might have tens very low frequency. He 3-bets a lot of jack X from the big blind, like jack 8 suited, jack 9 suited, queen jack suited, jack 10 suited, ace jack offsuit, king jack offsuit, ace jack suited, king jack suited. Even a lot of his 10x 3-bet, like 10 8 suited, 10 9 suited, hands like that. Even ace 10 off. So a lot of his middling and good top pairs end up in his 3-betting range. So a lot of his top pairs and middle pairs end up being the weaker ones, like 10 5 of spades, for example. So just overall, a much better board for the button. As long as your strategy includes betting this board very often and putting a lot of pressure on the big blind, then that strategy is likely okay. Keep those comments coming about your casinos, your local casinos, if they're opening with poker. I like to keep sort of a check on where live poker is, where it's back, where actual games are running. If it's running, how many handed is it, what stakes. I like those comments, so let me know. My favorite comment so far from anyone on any of my videos is someone commented 500 zoom, League of Legends, Diablo 3. There's no way this guy ever gets laid. That's my favorite one. And yes, I'm aware you can see my desktop here. I'm just not too concerned about it. Table 1, I think we can definitely bet range for 1/4, 1/3. Again, we want to do a lot of betting. Having a check back range isn't crazy though, just because a lot of our weak king X doesn't really need protection. And now on the turn, it's still a good turn for us. Good turn for the button overall. But it does improve a lot of his hands, and our hand has 0 equity. And I'm thinking, do we bluff all of our 0 equity hands on the river? I don't think we do. I don't think we bluff all of our 0 equity hands, so we'll just give this one up. And I think we have a good hand to raise on table 2 versus the small size especially. If someone's playing a strategy where they bet super small, overall our strategy will include more raises. This turn's not the best for us. We'll overbet a small percentage here, but mostly checking. Okay, we get a super high number, but I still... Actually, no. We're not going to overbet with this hand. I think our hand is just too low equity to barrel on that turn. And now on the river, I think we can go for the 1/3 bet. He has hands like ace-4 of hearts, you know, king 5 of hearts, hands like that can fold versus the small bet on the river. And when we're bluffing, we can have hands like this that didn't have enough equity to quite barrel the turn. And then our value hands, we still have some queen X that check raise the flop but can't really bet the turn because on the turn we're going so polar. We can even lead the river for this size if we had a jack. Like if we raise the flop with jack, let's say like even something like jack 4 of hearts, and now we river a jack, I think that hand can bet for the 1/3 size. And then we will include, again, it's a similar spot to that other hand where we will include some traps in our range just to protect our small betting range. But most of our small betting range will be our value range, I mean, will be these weak value hands, and that's okay. We will defend that range appropriately when we face the raise. That's the key there. You don't need to have all of the nuts in your range when you bet small on the river there, because 10-9 off versus 2.5x is close. We're a bit deeper too, so it's like less attractive to call, but we'll make the call. We're making a video. So yeah, we don't need the nuts on the river when we bet 1/3 to defend appropriately versus his bluffs. You know, we'll just call sometimes when we have a queen. Like, we'll call sometimes when we have a jack. Loose float on table 2 with the 10 of clubs. Good turn card for us. I think we could even lead some of the time. The problem is it, yes, it improves 6-7, but the problem is that with these positions, we don't have all the 6-7 offsuit versus that raise size. So if we were button big blind, I think this turn has a significantly more leads. And now on the river, I think we just have to bluff. I'm just rolling for size here. I think our blockers perform better in the 1/3. I think we get heroed a lot in this spot, to be honest. Our value range is going to be basically just weak ace X or maybe pocket nines. Yeah, I think pocket nines could bet the river. We're getting a lot of similar spots here. This spot is similar to that other one. It has some similarities. It's not similar in the sense that if we had an 8 or a straight or a hand better than an 8, then the king 8 we could have opened on the button there. I was just distracted by explaining. If we had an 8 or better, we would likely want to mostly bet large on the river. So again, a spot where we're going to have two sizings. I think in most river spots, especially when the pot is very small, you should and will need to have two sizings to collect your share of the EV. Ace-9 suited, we can 3-bet a small percentage of the time. Okay, we get a 3-bet. I think versus this size, we want to 3-bet slightly more and obviously fold slightly more than if we were facing a smaller size. The larger the button opens for, the more we want to 3-bet and the more we want to fold and the less we want to call, obviously. Now this board is actually pretty good for the big blind. Our hand is not that good. It's not that good to barrel. We have bad blockers. We block his folding range. We never really pick up any turns. But I think the fact that this board is just so good for us, we could potentially even just bet half pot for range on the flop. And now on the king, I'm just deciding what to do. I think these no equity hands do want to barrel sometimes. And yeah, I'm gonna go for half pot again, just setting up a river shove. I feel like solver doesn't pick these hands on the turn to barrel. That hand is actually interesting. I'm gonna check that hand later. So obviously, best turn, I think, for us in the big blind. A jack is pretty good as well. Same with a queen. A king, a queen, or a jack, I think, are the best turns, but a king specifically is better, I think. A king, and then a jack, and then a queen, in that order, are the best turns, I believe. And I know we bet a lot on this turn. I'm just thinking, is my hand slightly too weak to bet on the turn. I think if we want to make a mistake in this spot, we don't have to raise or do anything with the 8-9 off versus that size. Versus any bet there, really. We have lots of hands that are better bluff raises with better blockers, and we have lots of value hands, so we're protected. Yeah, I think in this spot here, in the replayer, if we want to make a mistake, I think being too aggressive is a better mistake than being too passive in this spot. I don't know what to do versus a 50 big blind player on the button after the small blind call. I know this hand gets squeezed slightly less after the small blind call. Gets 3-bet slightly less compared to if it was heads up, I mean. But with the 50 BB stack, I was just thinking this hand is actually a really good 3-bet versus a 50 BB stack, because the off-suited broadways become much better 3-bets as blockers are more important, and the stack-off threshold becomes lower in terms of hand value when you are shorter stacked. I think a big raise actually makes sense here. We're basically saying we have a straight flush or the ace of clubs when we raise the turn. And I think he just gets off too easy if we just check call and then check to him on the river. Potentially not enough follow-throughs with bluffs and just too many hands that get to see the free river. And our bluffs there. It's an interesting spot because obviously our bluffs are going to be the hands that don't have a club, so maybe like a straight draw would be a good bluff in that spot. So if on the turn, if we had, let's say, queen 5 of spades, that might be a good bluff raise, because when we have queen 5 of spades, we have equity versus his calling range that isn't a flush, even though we're drawing dead versus all of his flushes. Because he will have some sets, like let's say he has 10 of spades, 10 of diamonds, that check back the flop. Now on the turn, he bets small because he kind of wants, I don't know, not to see a club on the river. You can get value potentially. There's still a straight draw out there. Like this hand here on table 2 would be normally like a half 3-bet for me or something along those lines, but at 40 BB stack depths, these offsuit Broadway hands are much better 3-bets. You wouldn't want to 3-bet a hand like 6-5 suited at 50 BB stack depths, but you would want to 3-bet a hand like king 10 off slightly more. I like our hand to check back. The check jam from him is a real thing. It's a better board for the button, for sure, especially at these stack depths, I think. Now I have absolutely no clue what to do on the turn. I don't think this is a fold, but I'm going to make the nitty fold. Pretty sure that one would have to call at least some of the time. So yeah, this hand here, we would rather have a queen when we bluff raise the turn, because he can still have a set, and a queen has equity versus a set. Whereas if we check raise with just total air, like just 5-3 of hearts or something, we have 0 equity. Which you might, on the surface think, well, that's fine because we're drawing, like any hand we have basically as a bluff is drawing dead versus his flushes. So I'm gonna bet small on this board, and I don't like it. I'm just gonna bet small and hope he folds, and he folds, so that's great. If he folded, I think he had a worse hand, but that's totally fine with 9s on that board. It's a good board for our range, but I think with specifically 9s, we don't really realize. Another hand to check raise the turn might be a hand like 2 pair to have some equity when he does have the nuts. Or maybe this spot is a little bit unique in that we can mergey raise with some hands like the 7 of clubs, 8 of clubs, or queen of clubs, because those hands do have some straight flush outs versus the ace of clubs. Overall, it's a kind of a cool spot. I think pre-flop is a decision as well. And we'll check back the sixes. We benefit a lot from protection, and this board is better for us. Better for the button. But the small blind can have lots of hands like king 7 suited, king 8 suited, 7s, 8s, 8-7 suited. The big blind can still have tons of strong hands. We'll 3-bet some of the time here, even versus the shorter stack. I think at 80 bigs, this hand is still a pretty good 3-bet. The shorter you get, the less good it becomes, of course. Like even this hand here, I should have rolled at 50 BB if I was attempting to play the spot GTO-wise, I think. Rolled for a 3-bet pre-flop, I think, is what I mean. Okay, we'll call. We'll call with our jack here. When he snap checks back, I'm putting him on a lot of ace highs. I don't even think he has a 9 or a straight draw very often. Like, I don't think he has a hand that will bluff versus us. I think he has just so much ace high, and I don't have any good logic, but I'm just gonna bet a size that I think ace high will call me. Okay. Maybe he had a low pocket pair that got counterfeited. Five, 6 suited, we'll 3-bet like half the time. Big blind versus cutoff. You could do it more, you could do it less. It's obviously fine either way. As long as you're making sure to include enough 3-bets from the big blind, then that's the most important part, because it's very tempting to just call and not get 4-bet because your hand plays great as a just call. The good news about 5-6 suited is that if we get 4-bet, we can call. Bad board for the small blind on table 1, but not the worst board in the world. If the 2 was a 6, it would be a much worse board, because at least on this board we have a lot of our ace highs have a lot of equity. We're never gonna fold a 6 versus half pot on the flop, and raising it some of the time. Okay, we get a raise. I don't want to raise too big, because the hands I'm targeting to fold are his just like overcards that decided to stab the flop. And we're not going to be, despite the texture, we're actually not raising the flop super polar. It's not like we're raising the flop only with sets, 2 pairs, or straights. We're gonna raise the flop with even some overcards with 1 diamond, some over pairs, some 5x, some 3x with a straight draw, maybe a hand like ace 2 some of the time. So it's relatively merged, and we still do mostly raise for protection. And depending how often you are checking this flop, if you're playing it as a check your range, then we will be check raising very, very aggressively, because we're just going to have more hand candidates that want to check raise the flop compared to if some of those hands went into our betting range on the flop. So yeah, again, in theory, the spot, maybe you want to have 2 sizes, 2 check raise sizes on the flop, but that's too complicated for me. And if I had to choose one size, I think the smaller size makes sense. Going 3x rather than like 5x. So I think these suited Broadway hands want to squeeze more in general in these spots. But with the 250 BB stacks here, I am fearing the squeeze jam and I have to fold. And it's such a horrible, horrible spot to squeeze and then fold versus one of these back shoves. And the back shove is a real thing. We can 3-bet these hands some of the time. He's a bit shorter, so versus the min raise from the small blind, I'm not exactly sure what our range should be, but I know we're basically never folding. Like maybe 7-2 off is a fold because of the rake, but even that, I think maybe we have the right price to call. So this board is actually pretty good for us, because at these stack depths, he doesn't get to call as many of these like low suited connector hands. Obviously, it's not an amazing board, but it's okay. I would say maybe it's like a neutral board. It looks a lot worse than it is, and our hand is just pure garbage. So we'll check back table one. Our hand is pure garbage. The 3 of clubs blocker is relatively okay. The king of spades is kind of neutral. We have no playability. I like mostly just betting the flop and then expecting to give up always. I think our preferred size on this turn in general, I'm not sure with our hand because our hand is unique obviously, but I think our preferred size in general is just a medium bet on this turn. I have seen some spots where you'll see a similar texture and then you'll see a lot of overbets. But I think that is more so in the spots where there is no straight flush possible. And I'm just trying to get heroed by a heart. I don't think he actually has the ace of hearts very often. I think that hand mostly bets the turn, or if it does chuck the turn facing that bet, I think it's going to find some raises. So I didn't really want to overbet the river. But that could be a thing with our hand, obviously. It's kind of hard to go too wrong when you have a straight flush. We'll call the queen nine off versus that size. I think we're probably indifferent with the queen nine off. One of the worst boards for the button, sorry, for the big blind, one of the best boards for the button is triple Broadway boards. And he can do a lot of things. He can just start, you can start potting, he can overbet, he can bet small, he can check back some hands, he can do a lot of different things. Same with this board here on the ace king 3. And he overbet, which is a thing on that board. You can basically do whatever you want on these boards where you're crushing your opponent. I think if the turn was a 9 of clubs or a jack of clubs or potentially even the ace of clubs, we would start leading in theory. Not necessarily with our hand potentially, but definitely with some hands. Those are by far the worst turns for the button, and he will be checking them back, or at least he should be checking them back a lot. Because when he bets that size on the flop, we don't really check raise that many flush draws. So when the turn comes a club, we just have infinite flushes. Way more than he does because we called the big blind. King 10 suited here, I think we're gonna mostly 4-bet it. Cutoff versus button, we'll mostly 4-bet it. You can mix some calls in. Overall, a spot where we want to be 4-betting a lot. Of course, the downside to 4-betting being that when he jams, you have to fold, where your hand could very profitably call the 3-bet and see a flop and realize some flop equity, but that's just the way the spot plays. You want to be playing aggressive. 7's not strong enough to cold 4-bet here. I've seen some pre-flop solutions, I guess you would call them, that includes 9s at low frequency, that includes like some 8s at low frequency, even folding like some 10s but choosing to 3-bet some 9s and 8s some of the time. And I think that's for board coverage when we have to play a 4-bet pot when the small blind just calls us. But overall, I think if you wanted to simplify and just, for your pairs, just cold 4-bet 10s plus there, I think that's very reasonable. We can raise some of the time with the ace-5 versus the small bet on table 2, especially if we assume that he's playing a strategy that includes multiple bet sizes on the flop, which I think this player is, as evidenced by his overbet on the ace-king 3 board, but that is a different spot being on the button. Maybe this spot he's just playing a 1/3 with range. What I'm trying to say is that if he's splitting his range into multiple sizes on the flop, then I'm not saying it's a mistake. I'm saying it should be like this, but the smaller size will include weaker hands on average, and the larger size will include stronger hands on average, and that's totally fine. It's just that we should be, theory-wise, raising slightly more versus the small size, compared to if he just bets the small size with all of his range. Because when he bets the small size with all of his range, all of his strong hands are in their full frequency as opposed to low frequency. Now, I don't know what to do on this table, too. I think I'm going to make the nitty check back. So he bet 1/3, bet 1/4 on the turn. I'm just not sure what calls us. And versus the check raise, we're in a horrible spot. We're pretty capped because we would never... we don't just call a 9 on the turn very often. So yeah, I'm going to make the check back. We're super capped. He can still have traps like aces and kings, pocket 9s even, ace 9, king 9, where a lot of our hands versus 1/3 on the flop like ace 9 or king 9 will raise at decent frequency. If he bets 1/4 on the turn, we'll raise at decent frequency whenever we have a 9. Doing some calling, but... And we don't really even have 7s because... I think on the turn 7s would fold. King 8 suited is close. I'll 3-bet it 25% of the time. King 10 suited versus the unknown player. We'll go for the 3-bet. Can mix in some calls as well, depending on how you want to play the button. Good board for the cutoff, bad board for the button on table 2. I think these hands mostly want to check the flop back. No backdoor, no straight draw. Just king high. And we find some bluffs on later streets. We get our low number. Again, I think this hand mostly wants to bluff the river. Just not quite having the right equity or blockers to bet on a board that is better for the cutoff than it is for the button. It wouldn't be even crazy for cutoff to have a leading range on the flop. And now on the river with just king high, despite the flush coming in and us not having a club blocker, I think these types of hands make it into the betting range. Okay, that's a pretty reasonable call, I guess. Very, very reasonable call. The 3 of clubs is it is actually a relevant blocker because I never have a 3 of clubs bluff, and I do have ace 3 of clubs that traps twice, very low frequency. And the 3 of hearts, I guess, is a... Again, I never have a bluff that has the 3 of hearts. And when you're thinking about bluff catching, yes, it's good to block your opponent's value, but if you don't block any of his bluffs, sometimes that's more important than blocking some of his value. If you have 2 completely neutral blockers that he never has a hand that he's bluffing when you have those, it's usually a call if you beat his bluffs. At least some of the time. I mean, obviously we hate our hand in terms of blockers. We block king jack of diamonds and jack 10 of diamonds on the river, but I think those find 1/3 leads a lot of the time, or bets on the turn themselves. Versus the weaker player, I'm gonna just play this flop as a bet 1/3 with my range. All right, I'm gonna empty the clip here. I was gonna overbet and follow through blank rivers. I think it's just a good spot to do so versus a weaker player. because they have so many calls on the turn. It's a good spot to do it in general. With our hand, I don't think we always want to be betting the turn in theory, because when these boards are double draw, you have so many better bluffs, but it's just such a good spot for us after we bet 1/3 and he calls. So betting this hand, probably still mostly, I'd say, theory-wise on the turn. And you can have a normal bet, you can have an over bet. They both kind of make some sense here. If I had to pick one, I would pick the over bet, I think. I think specifically this spot, this turn spot, if you are overbetting it a lot as a bluff and then not following through on rivers, especially brick rivers, then you're giving up a lot of EV. Losing a lot of EV, I should say. This is a spot you should be following through a lot on the river. There's some spots where you could argue, you know, exploitatively, they continue on the turn with a stronger range than they're supposed to. Same on the flop. So by the time you get to the river, their real range is much tighter than what a solver's range would be on the river. And versus that range, you're going to bluff less, and your threshold for value betting is going to also increase. But this spot, think of all the hands that he can call you on the turn with, like 2x of diamonds, 10x of diamonds, jack x of clubs, ace x of clubs. Jack X with a straight draw, Ace X, just random Ace X, you know, 10X with a straight draw like Queen 10, King 10, 4-5 of clubs, 4-5 of diamonds, 9-8 of diamonds that didn't 3-bet, you know, 8-7 of diamonds, 8-7 of clubs. Just so many hands that have to fold the river. And yes, you beat some of those with King High when you check back. We get our low frequency call with Ace Queen off, which is fine. If you wanted to 3-bet it pure with these positions, I think that's also fine. It's nice to have Ace Queen sometimes. And it kind of changes the strategy on like Ace Queen X boards, but that's kind of a small thing. We can actually bet Ace Queen kind of for value / protection here. We're not loving the check raise, but we're happy to call it. I think our hand is actually considerably ahead of his check raising range. And I think we want to bet more on the flop when we have a diamond or a heart. And I think we want to check back less when we don't, although I could be wrong on that spot. Low frequency 3-bet with 7-8 suited there. Yeah, this spot here, the 9-9-3. I'm just thinking, would we rather have a heart? And normally in these spots, we rather have hearts because we block our opponent's full raising range and continuing range. But in this case with Ace Queen, because we're kind of like a value hand, you could, if you want to classify this as a value hand, sorry, if you want to classify this as anything, I would classify it as a value hand, even though it's not really a useful classification. So if it's a value hand, then we don't really want to block his continues, then, do we? We get a check on table 1. It's a good board for the small blind still. We have Jack 8 off, and so does he, but he doesn't have 8-5 off or Jack 5 off. All the suited 2 pairs we have as well. We have 8-5 suited, Jack 5 suited. So in terms of raw equity and nut advantage, we're actually ahead because, you know, we have the over pairs. We have Jacks and 8s pure, he doesn't. We have Jack 8 suited pure, he doesn't. We have Jack 5 suited pure, he doesn't. But it's a very, very dynamic board, and we're out of position with huge SPR remaining. So we want to have a considerable checking range, and then when we do face a bet, we want to be check raising very aggressively. On a brick turn, On table 1, I think we want to start putting a lot of pressure. A lot of pressure, even with our hand. But on the 8 of clubs turn, it's one of the least brick rivers there is. And he will have a lot of 8x that checks back. On that board, he's going to have a lot of flush draws that check back because we're playing so aggressively versus the betting strategy on the flop. Of course, he's going to find some bluffs on the 8 turn as well, but I don't think we have to do anything versus that size with king 10 of hearts. King 10 offsuit with the 10 of clubs, I think, is an interesting decision if we do get to the turn this way. I think we would have to continue either as a check raise bluff or a check call, but it's close, very close. 6-7 off will mix in a small amount of raises. Our ISO range versus small blind limp will be mostly linear, but we still mix in some of these junky hands. Just like how the big blind's 3-betting range, big blind versus small blind is mostly linear with some junky components. Very good board for the big blind ISO range, I think. I think he's getting destroyed on this board. And a good turn for our range. I'm just thinking... I think this hand, if it wants to bluff, wants to mostly bluff heart rivers. So if check 2, we will bluff this pure, I think. And then if he bets, we'll raise it like small amount of the time. And I don't think we want to go for the overbet. I think we want to bet a size that we can still bet with a 10. Actually, no, this hand will overbet some of the time. Let's split it half. Okay, we get the overbet. So we still have some traps, and then our overbet size will include basically flushes or full houses. I think it's slightly... I wouldn't say it's like too thin to bet ace king here. It's just we don't show up with good kings in this line on the river like ever, because we're just going to be betting the turn extremely frequently. The only kings we really show up to the river with are weak kings that we got a low frequency check back on the turn, or full houses that we're trapping, like king 10 or king 5, or potentially pocket 10s, I guess, but I don't think I'm ever checking back the turn with pocket 5s. So on the river, our value ranges pocket 4s, flushes, full houses. Yeah, that's about it. Don't want to include too many bluffs in either range. You know, we want to include some bluffs in the normal betting size, and we want to include some bluffs in the over betting size. We don't want to leave one range with too many bluffs and not enough value hands, and vice versa. It's not an easy thing to do, and I am not doing it perfect, that's for sure. There's going to be lots of spots where maybe I'm including too many bluffs in the small size, and there's going to be lots of spots where maybe I'm including too many bluffs in the large size. The good news is I think that it's going to be tough for other people to figure out which spots those are, because it's tough for myself to even figure it out. We'll open the ace-5 off in the cutoff. It's a hand I've seen opened at like super low frequency in some charts, and then I've seen it folded at full frequency. Given that there's rake, I think folding it is probably better if we had to choose one option. In an unraked game, or if we had antes, this would be, I think, a pure open with 100 BB stacks. An interesting turn here. I think a 1/3 bet or a check back makes the most sense with our exact hand, but we can include some big bets or even over bets with part of our range. Our over bets won't be the typical over bets that you would see on a turn after you bet the flop and he calls. It's going to be more so like a 10x, a good 10x that check back the flop, or over pairs that check back the flop. Hands that are still strong enough to go for the over bet on the turn after it goes check check. Like even a hand like Jack 10 is strong enough to go for an over bet after check check check. I could be lying on that one, but I think it is. Alright, I'm going to wrap this video up. We'll play these last two hands here. We'll play this ace-8, and then that'll be it for this video. Quite the exciting end there with a fold. Alright, that's it for this one, guys. I will see you in the next one. Take care.